My face isn't like red, is it? Hey everyone, I'm Ross, founder of Siege Media, and today we're going to talk about finance content marketing best practices. So we have a lot of clients in the finance space, insurance, credit, etc. So we've built some lessons and learnings over time that I thought sharing some of those main tips we've been thinking about recently might be of use to you. So one thing that stood out as of late is just generally in finance, it's not as visually heavy always. A lot of the brand aesthetics make sense to be more leaned on the overall site framework rather than individual images such as photos, illustrations, etc. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. People want to see people. Something about that kind of communicates a sense of trust. So, in doing that, sometimes you have to really solve for UX, UI, the overall site experience more than you would in an e commerce or other site experience. It's because if you're putting out a ton of content, also, and a lot of these finance sites sometimes have thousands upon thousands of pages, you kind of have to solve for scale. You can't spend 400 hours per post if you're going to be NerdWallet and achieve thousands upon thousands of financial related articles. You have to build an experience that is high quality and reaches a 2x experience better than competitors at a more scale level. And what that requires is a good template. So if we look at NerdWallet in action, how they achieve this is functionally with their HTML framework, the design of the site rather than simply the individual images. That means they do include stock photo images, but it's not the primary element. It's more like a piece of it, part of the design story rather than the design story in looking at it. And how they do that is it's not a massive image, a really tall stock photo, because stock photos are often low quality. And what they do is they do a shorter image that is not as in your face, which basically reduces the impact the stock photo has while still using it and leveraging it in a high quality way. You can differentiate this between another example that is bigger in your face. It just feels lower quality because stock photos on average are lower quality. So this punch of color that they use, others like them use, like such as Student Loan Hero and other sites that have started to do this more. I think they were one of the first ones to do that. It shows how it can work for them. And if you go further down their site, you see they solve for a lot of the design needs that charts and images often require by simply having a good design framework. The H1s look clean, the tables look clean. They basically give you a pop of color that feels scannable, that allows for not inserting design assets in those contexts or images or etc. So by having these elements that feel high quality and they've spent a lot of time kind of crafting, they can then scale that out over thousands of pages and have that high quality experience. Not always do they completely not use design elements in this site setup, but it is something they commonly use. So if you are in finance and you are a site that is going to be content rich, I would suggest spending even more time and effort crafting that on-page experience immediately in the site design rather than the single page elements, which are still important, but you're going to need scale in order to achieve ironically, financially efficient outcomes with this site. So that's a first part that is especially important for our finance clients when they come to us and we see their single page experience just won't scale well in a way that is cost prohibitive to them, especially when comparing against competitors like NerdWallet, who are actually in most verticals these days. And you can see stock photos are a big piece of this in general in this market because something again about finance, there are illustration heavy businesses that are still successful. But I think the nature of finance and money means the whimsical tone of illustration, which is often used with illustration, just doesn't align with the brand of cash. So the brand of cash makes sense to have visuals, but you can't have a unique original photo every single time. So having these short stock photos, I think solves for that element of needing a punch of color without having to do original photography every time out. Another way that this is done is two things. One, you have a tint on a bigger image. So a kind of classy feeling tint image, as we'll show you here, creates a feeling of high quality that kind of overcomes the low quality aesthetic that is often found with stock photos. The second is the shorter height. So those two things in combination, a brand aesthetic tint. So maybe if you're green, you can use green. If you're yellowish, you put a yellowish tint. You can also combine real original photography elements with illustration elements like Policy Genius does in their blog design. These things can all form and match with a financial feeling while still being high quality. And you'll find a lot of really crappy finance sites that use bad stock photos because they basically overwhelm you with the stock or also don't apply a tint to it in a way that feels high quality and overcomes that aesthetic. So that's kind of a high quality macro experience thing that you need to know with that site. But once you've had that set up, you are creating the single page experiences and you want to do outreach, you want to do link building. Sometimes visuals will still very much make sense in that context. One thing to know about finance generally is bloggers just aren't a receptive market. So pretty much any financial site that comes to us, very rarely does it make sense for us to pitch finance bloggers because they always ask for money just by the nature of that market. So what we do is find their buyer persona and align it to several different link markets. So really they match to every single link market that isn't the blogger sector, at least from a personal finance standpoint. And what those are national news, local news, which are basically survey and data study type assets that you have to build and promote. Also, link page type markets. So if you're doing things to seniors or people with disabilities or like those educational, really in-depth guide type resources that also tie into finance, you can build something that's relevant there and be successful. And then also tangential blogger markets. So often we'll do personal finance plus wellness or personal finance plus careers. These tangential but still related markets on the blogger area will allow us to create nice visuals, whether it's original photography or some illustration if applicable and it matches the brand. And those kind of markets will allow you to be successful from a content marketing standpoint. Well, if you went head on into personal finance, you're not going to be successful with your content. But also don't be stupid and don't do off-brand content that has nothing to do with personal finance just to do it. And I've seen that happen as well and will lead to less success for your campaign. Next, in finance, calculators are a big part of what most markets will do. Money, numbers, they basically back into calculators in some way. So most finance will have at least one or two finance terms that require calculators, if not several. So some best practices in order to rank there that I would suggest is simply solve for time to answer on your calculators for as big of a percentage of your audience as possible. So what I mean by time to answer for the biggest percentage of your audience as possible is if you have a mortgage calculator, you could default to the term limits that are most common for the biggest audience. So you could say the interest rate that's common today and default that into the form field so they don't have to type that in. You could also do a 30-year mortgage, which is also the most common. If you make someone type something in, you're basically increasing friction and increasing the time to answer, which could cause them to bounce back, which cause them to not complete the calculator field and also not overall have a great experience. So you can see this in play with Credit Karma in particular. I think they actually rank pretty well, but you can see in their design aesthetic, they require you to input these fields. They don't give you any defaults. This requires a higher time to answer on average. It also is somewhat dissonance inducing based on the input's description is pretty far from the input itself, which causes some like brain work in order to do that. Don't make people think from SEO standpoint if you want to have success. Their overall font on the description part is a little small, hard to read. It's not the best experience. But if you compare to someone like Bankrate, who actually I think has amazing calculators on average, everything is completely above the fold. You're hit with it right away. Also, the form fields default to those common options on a lot of their calculators. It's big font. It's easy to digest and understand how to get to the next step. And also from an SEO standpoint, you're hitting people in the face right away, and you don't even have to move to solve most of their calculators. And then going back to NerdWallet, which we spoke so well of, they generally have really good calculators. I don't want to say they don't, but on a few, you actually have to work to get to the calculator. So if you scroll down on their calculators, you'll notice you have to scroll down. On the Bankrate example, you don't. You get the information immediately on almost all of them, and you can tell they were very deliberate about pushing content all the way up above the fold, is nudging it as high as they possibly could in order to get that in your peripheral vision immediately. Because it does add a few seconds and get you a longer time to answer by having to scroll down on the page to get to the calculator. So these things in general create some friction, lower, and make the experience a little bit worse for your calculator. So if you can lower that time to answer on average, and every calculator is a little bit different in terms of should you have a chart, should it be one step, what should it be next. But if you test that, you can actually do some A/B tests like when do people actually hit that finish page of the calculator if that's applicable? When do they hit that calculator page? When do they bounce? If the smaller that is, if you can actually measure and watch their activity to get to that final page, the better the outcome it is for you. And I would bet would result in higher rankings for all those financially related calculator terms. Another thing that is really relevant in finance as well is there are a lot of questions with cost involved in some way, or just quick answers. People want to know what is a 401k? What is a Roth IRA? How much is car insurance? What does disability insurance cost? All these have different quick answers that are relevant, and there's a ton of them. And of course, Google is now showing those answers, taking the clicks. But the reality is we got to fight fire with fire and give a quick answer experience, which is there because users want that. So on our websites, I think we should solve for the same kind of thing that Google is solving for because they know what users want and we want to give them a quick answer too. So Policy Genius, I think, is an amazing example of this. They have several examples of basically people asking a question and them giving you the answer without ever having to get to like typical 16 pixel font or less. They hit you with it in a very punchy above the fold area, which solves your question. And yes, you can dig in after that. And I think that is an amazing experience that really is solving for what people want these days. And they do it in several different ways where they give you a question and they do the Q and the A, which is nicely designed and gives a nice Policy Genius brand pop. All that I think is why Policy Genius is doing so well from their SEO point of view. And another thing that I think is especially relevant for these quick answers and cost type terms to think about from a financial content marketing standpoint is when people often reference data points from a linkability standpoint passively. We do this with our clients in terms of setting them up to rank for things that people are going to passively search for it and then reference it. That's bloggers, that's news reporters. These things get commonly done over and over again because they want to find a reference point that said, this is the number. And that happens a lot in finance because of that financial nature of what it is. So if you're thinking about that strategically, like Policy Genius does, like NerdWallet does, but I think especially Policy Genius, you want to rank early and be very deliberate about ranking for these assets that have that high passive linkability intent, because that can carry you. That can carry you far, and it can basically reduce the need for manual link building in these markets. It's still very necessary, but to be cost prohibitive, as we talked about earlier, you have to be efficient such that you are passively acquiring links and also manually acquiring links to kind of combine and be the most efficient site that you can be. So I would especially think about the user experience, the UI, and also just getting those assets ranking early in order to power the rest of your rankings, which might be car insurance quotes, which might be disability insurance, life insurance quotes. All those things factor into our overall financial content marketing strategy that hopefully you can use. So this isn't the full breadbasket as it were from a financial content marketing standpoint, but these are some of the core tips I've been thinking about recently in this market. So if you have any of yourself, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and let us know what you thought. Thanks for watching.